Part 1. The Galactic Fear Index was the most important document in known space. Every species that had ever achieved faster-than-light travel knew about it. Every government consulted it before making contact with new civilizations. Every military commander studied it before planning any operation that might put their forces near another species' territory. The index had existed for 12,000 standard cycles, maintained by the archivists of. They were so old that they had watched stars be born and die. They had seen empires rise and fall across 100,000 worlds. They kept records of everything, but the Fear Index was their most famous work. The index ranked every known sapient species by how dangerous they were. It measured things like technology, aggression, population, territorial expansion, and dozens of other factors. If you wanted to know whether to trade with a new species or avoid them entirely, you checked the index. If you wanted to know whether your military could win a war against your neighbor, you checked the index. The system worked well. It had prevented countless unnecessary conflicts and helped civilizations make smart decisions about who to trust and who to fear. When humans achieved faster-than-light travel and made first contact with the wider galaxy, the archivists added them to the index like they did every new species. The initial entry was not particularly impressive. Species Homo from the planet Earth in what they called the Sol system, carbon-based life. Primates evolved from tree-dwelling ancestors, moderate technological development. They had nuclear weapons, basic genetic engineering, and primitive artificial intelligence. Nothing special by galactic standards. The archivists noted a few interesting things. Humans were persistent predators, meaning they hunted by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They showed unusual pattern recognition abilities. They were tribal but could form large cooperative groups when motivated. They had a strange tolerance for high-gravity environments and temperature extremes. But overall, humanity ranked in the middle third of the index. Dangerous enough to respect, but not dangerous enough to worry about. The archivists filed their entry and moved on to more pressing matters. For 300 years, that assessment remained unchanged. Humans expanded slowly into nearby systems. They traded peacefully with their neighbors. They joined several minor diplomatic organizations. They seemed content to be a small, quiet species on the edge of civilized space. Then came the Umbral campaigns. There were apex predators from a binary star system. There orbited two bright suns, which meant it never experienced true darkness. Even at night, at least one sun was always above the horizon. They had evolved in constant light, and their civilization reflected this. Their cities blazed with illumination. Their ships shone like small suns. They considered darkness to be primitive and barbaric. They were also aggressive expansionists. For 1,000 years, they had been slowly conquering territory from weaker species. Their military was powerful, their technology was advanced, and their confidence was absolute. The index ranked them in the top 15% of known species. When they decided to expand into a region of space called the Cygnus Reach, no one expected any problems. The Reach was an undesirable area, filled with rogue planets that drifted between stars, dying suns that gave off barely any light, and vast stretches of empty darkness. Most species avoided it entirely. There was nothing valuable there, and the permanent darkness made it psychologically uncomfortable for almost every known civilization. But humans had been there for decades. The first colonies had been established almost a century before they arrived. Humans had settled on frozen rocks orbiting brown dwarfs, stars so dim they barely qualified as stars at all. They had built stations in the shadows of gas giants, where sunlight was a distant memory. They had made homes on moons that were tidally locked, with one side always facing away from any source of light. The rest of the galaxy thought they were insane. Why would anyone choose to live in permanent darkness? The archivists had noted it as a minor curiosity in humanity's file, but hadn't thought much about it. They certainly didn't think much about it. When their expansion fleet arrived in the Cygnus Reach and discovered human colonies, they simply demanded that the humans leave. This was territory now. The humans could relocate to systems with actual sunlight, like civilized beings. The humans refused. This surprised the humans were not ranked highly on the fear index. They had no major military victories to their name. Their technology was inferior. A sensible species would recognize the obvious power difference and withdraw. Instead, the human colonial government sent back a simple message: "These are our homes. We will defend them." The commander, a warrior named the Radiant, was amused. He had conquered 17 species in his career. His fleet had over 200 warships, all of them bristling with weapons and blazing with light. The humans in the Cygnus Reach had perhaps 30 vessels, most of them converted cargo ships with basic defensive armaments. He gave them one standard cycle to reconsider. They did not respond. The Battle of Frozen Haven was supposed to be a simple operation. The largest human colony in the region orbited a brown dwarf so dim that sensors could barely detect it. The colonists had built their stations into a cluster of asteroids, using the rocks for protection and resources. Perhaps 50,000 humans lived there. Brought 40 warships. It was excessive force, but he wanted to send a message to any other humans who might think of resisting. The fleet arrived in perfect formation, lights blazing, weapons hot. Broadcast his final ultimatum on all channels: surrender or be destroyed. There was no response. The fleet moved toward the colony. Sensors showed the human stations clearly, heat signatures bright against the cold of space. There were a few small ships nearby, but nothing that could threaten a. Then the lights on the lead ship went out. Watched on his command display as the forward destroyer simply went dark. All systems offline. No distress signal. No explanation. One moment it was there, blazing with light, and the next it was just a cold shape drifting in the void. Before he could order an investigation, 2 more ships went dark. The fleet scattered into defensive formation. Warriors shouted for information. Sensors swept the darkness around them, but there was nothing there, nothing they could see. Then the attacks began in earnest. Ships died in silence. There were no visible weapons fire, no enemy vessels on sensors, no warning of any kind. One moment a ship was fully operational and the next it was dead. Lights out, engines cold, crew not responding to communications. Ordered his fleet to illuminate the area around them with everything they had: floodlights, flares, emergency beacons. The darkness pushed back, but only a little. Beyond the edge of their light there was nothing but black. Something moved at the edge of visibility. A shape, dark against dark. Then it was gone. The battle lasted 6 hours. They never saw their enemy clearly. Human ships ran cold and silent, invisible to thermal sensors. They had painted their hulls with materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They communicated in frequencies they couldn't detect. They struck from the darkness like ghosts. When finally ordered a retreat, he had lost 23 ships. His crew was terrified. Warriors who had never known fear in their lives were jumping at shadows, flinching at the darkness outside their viewports. The humans lost 2 ships. News of the Battle of Frozen Haven spread across the galaxy. The archivists of requested detailed reports from both sides. What they received from them was filled with confusion and terror. What they received from the humans was calm, professional, and precise. They had entered what humans called a kill zone. The defenders had prepared the in advance, seeding it with sensors and communication relays. They knew exactly where every enemy ship was at all times. The enemy knew nothing. The archivists read the reports with growing interest. This was not how most species fought. This was something different. This was hunting. Part 2. Ambassador of the diplomatic Concord arrived at the human colony world of New Helsinki, expecting to mediate a minor territorial dispute. The Concord was one of the oldest and most respected neutral organizations in the galaxy. When conflicts arose between species, they sent ambassadors to negotiate peaceful solutions. The situation in the Cygnus Reach seemed straightforward. A powerful species had tried to take territory from a weaker one. The weaker species had resisted successfully, but surely they understood they couldn't win a prolonged war against the sensible solution was a negotiated withdrawal with some face-saving concessions for both sides. Had mediated dozens of such conflicts. She was confident this one would be resolved quickly. She was wrong. The first thing that surprised her was the human colony itself. New Helsinki orbited a star that the humans called Star, a dim red dwarf that produced only a fraction of the light of a normal sun. The planet existed in a state of permanent twilight, even at midday. Most species would have found it deeply uncomfortable. The humans had built a thriving city. Shuttle landed at the main spaceport, and she was escorted to the government district by a human named James, who worked as a liaison for the colonial administration. He was friendly and professional, answering her questions about the colony with obvious pride. "We have about 3 million people here now," he explained as they walked through the city streets. "Most of our food comes from underground farms. We generate power from geothermal sources. It's a good life." Looked around at the city. The lighting was minimal by galactic standards. Most species would have flooded their streets with artificial illumination to compensate for the dim sun. The humans used only what they needed to see. The shadows between buildings were deep and dark. "Does the darkness not bother your people?" she asked. Smiled. It was a strange expression, she thought, not quite friendly. "We like the dark, Ambassador. It feels like home." The negotiations took place in a large conference room with a single window looking out over the city. The human delegation was led by Governor Wei, a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. She was polite but firm. "We have no intention of leaving the Cygnus Reach," she said simply. "Those colonies are our homes. We've built them over generations. We will not abandon them because they decided they want the territory." Nodded carefully. "I understand your attachment, Governor, but surely you recognize the military reality. They have one of the largest fleets in the galaxy. They have conquered dozens of species. Your victory at Frozen Haven was impressive, but it was only one battle." Governor's expression didn't change. "It wasn't only one battle, Ambassador. While you were traveling here, we fought 7 more engagements. We won all of them." Stared at her. 7. They sent 3 more fleets into the Reach. We destroyed or captured most of their ships. They've lost over 200 vessels now. We've lost 11. This was impossible. They were one of the most powerful military forces in known space. They did not lose battles, certainly not against a species ranked in the middle of the fear index. How asked. Governor leaned back in her chair. "Do you know what the Cygnus Reach is like, Ambassador? No stars nearby, no ambient light, just darkness everywhere all the time. They have never experienced true darkness. They evolved on a world with 2 suns. They're afraid of it. And humans are not." The governor smiled, that strange smile that was beginning to recognize. "Humans are very afraid of the dark, Ambassador. Every child on Earth grows up scared of what might be hiding in the shadows. We tell stories about monsters in the darkness. We have nightmares about being alone in the black." She leaned forward. "But we also learned a very long time ago that we could be the thing in the darkness. We could be the monster." Requested permission to review the battle records from the Umbral campaigns. The humans agreed without hesitation. What she saw changed her understanding of human beings completely. The human military did not fight like any other species she had studied. They did not seek decisive engagements with massed fleets. They did not try to overpower their enemies with superior firepower. Instead, they hunted. Their ships were designed to be invisible. They ran their systems at minimal power, bleeding heat so slowly that they were indistinguishable from background radiation. Their hulls were coated with materials that absorbed light and sensor waves. In the darkness of the Cygnus Reach, they were ghosts. They seeded though with passive sensors that listened for enemy ships. They communicated in tight beam transmissions that could only be detected if you knew exactly where to look. They coordinated attacks with precision that seemed almost supernatural to the. And they waited. Human ships would drift in the darkness for days, engines cold, crews silent, waiting for their prey to come to them. When the enemy fleet arrived, they would watch and wait some more. They mapped patrol routes. They identified command ships. They found weaknesses in formations. Then, when the moment was perfect, they struck. The attack runs were surgical. Human ships would emerge from the darkness without warning, disable their targets with precise weapons fire, and vanish back into the black before the enemy could respond. They targeted engines first, leaving ships drifting and helpless. Then they targeted weapons, then communications. The surrounded by darkness they couldn't see through, never knew when the next attack would come. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't relax. Every shadow might hide death. One captain who was captured and later released described the experience. "We were not fighting a battle. We were being eaten, slowly, one ship at a time, and we couldn't do anything to stop it." Interviewed several human military officers during her time on New Helsinki. One conversation stayed with her more than any other. Commander Sarah was a veteran of the Umbral campaigns. She had personally led boarding actions on 17 vessels. She was young by human standards, with dark skin and a calm demeanor that found unsettling. "How do you fight in complete darkness?" asked. "How do you navigate? How do you coordinate with your teams?" Commander shrugged. "Training, mostly. We spend years learning to operate in zero-light conditions. You learn to use your other senses: sound, touch, the feeling of air movement. You learn to build a map in your head and update it as you move." "But surely they have superior technology, night vision, thermal sensors, things that let them see in the dark." "They do, and we know how to defeat all of them. We control our body temperature. We move slowly enough that motion sensors can't pick us up. We communicate in frequencies their equipment doesn't monitor." She paused. "And honestly, their technology doesn't help them much. They're so used to light that they don't know how to function without it. They panic. They make mistakes. They shoot at shadows and give away their positions." "Thought about this. You said humans are afraid of the dark, but you sound like you enjoy it." Commander's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We are afraid, Ambassador. Fear is useful. It makes you alert. It makes you careful. But we learned a long time ago that fear goes both ways. If you're the thing hiding in the darkness, then everything else has to be afraid of you." Left New Helsinki with a preliminary report for the diplomatic Concord. Her recommendation was unusual. Do not attempt to mediate this conflict. The humans had no intention of surrendering, and she was no longer sure they needed to. She also sent a private message to the archivists of the Fear Index entry for humanity needed to be reviewed, urgently. Part 3. The archivists of took their responsibilities seriously. The Fear Index was not just a document. It was a tool that helped civilizations survive. An inaccurate entry could lead to catastrophic miscalculations, wars that should have been avoided, or dangerous species being underestimated until it was too late. When Ambassador's report arrived, the senior archivists read it with growing concern. They requested additional information from every source they could find: battle reports, psychological evaluations, historical records, biological studies. What they learned troubled them deeply. The archivists understood predators. The galaxy was full of species that had evolved as hunters, and the index had classifications for all of them. There were ambush predators who struck from hiding. There were pack hunters who worked together to bring down large prey. There were pursuit predators who chased their targets until they collapsed. Humans were something different. On there, humans had evolved on a planet with a 24-hour rotation. Half of every day was darkness. Not the dim twilight of a red dwarf world, not the occasional eclipse of a binary system, but true night, deep black darkness that lasted for hours. Most predators on Earth were nocturnal. They hunted in the darkness, using the night to hide their approach. Humans, who had evolved from prey animals, should have been helpless against these hunters. They had no natural weapons. They were slower than most predators. Their senses were not particularly sharp. But humans had something else. They had intelligence, and they had each other. The archivists studied human history and found a pattern that disturbed them profoundly. Humans had learned to use fire not just for warmth and cooking, but as a weapon against the darkness. They had learned to work together in groups, taking turns standing watch while others slept. They had developed tools for hunting at night, traps and snares that didn't require them to see their prey. And somewhere along the way, they had stopped being afraid of the dark. No, that wasn't quite right. They were still afraid. Fear of darkness was hardwired into human neurology, a survival instinct that had helped their ancestors stay alive. But they had learned to use that fear instead of being controlled by it. Human children were told stories about monsters in the darkness. But those stories weren't just warnings. They were training. They taught children that the darkness could be survived, that monsters could be defeated, that fear could be overcome. By the time humans reached adulthood, they had internalized a fundamental truth. The darkness was dangerous, but they could be more dangerous. The Umbral campaigns were the first time humans had applied this principle on a galactic scale, and the results were devastating. They had never lost a war. In 1,000 years of expansion, they had conquered every species they had fought. Their military doctrine was based on overwhelming force and superior technology. They had never needed to learn subtlety. Against the humans, their advantages meant nothing. Their ships were bright and loud, easy to track in the silent darkness of the Cygnus Reach. Their crews were psychologically unprepared for prolonged operations in lightless environments. Their commanders kept making the same mistake. They assumed that their technology would let them see through the darkness. The humans let them believe this. They let the scan and probe and search, finding nothing. And when the relaxed, convinced that they were safe, the humans struck. It was not just tactical superiority. It was psychological warfare. Human forces deliberately left survivors after their attacks. They wanted them to know what had happened. They wanted stories to spread about ships that died in silence, about enemies that could see in the dark, about the terrible things that waited in the spaces between stars. Those who had never known fear learned it quickly. 18 months after the conflict began, they sued for peace. They agreed to withdraw from the Cygnus Reach entirely. They paid reparations for the colonies they had damaged. They signed treaties promising to never enter human territory again. The archivists have convened a special session to discuss humanity's index entry. For the first time in 4,000 cycles, they gathered in person to debate a single species. The discussion lasted 72 standard days. The problem was not simply that humans were dangerous. Many species were dangerous. The index had categories for all kinds of threats. What the archivists struggled with was the nature of human danger. Most species could be understood through their capabilities. You measured their weapons, their ships, their numbers, and you knew how much of a threat they posed. Humans didn't work that way. Human technology was not particularly advanced. Their population was not particularly large. Their territory was not particularly extensive. By most metrics, they should have ranked somewhere in the middle of the index, exactly where they had been classified for 300 years. But those metrics missed something essential. Humans had evolved to treat darkness as a hunting ground. They were psychologically adapted to use fear as a tool. They had spent millions of years learning to survive in conditions that would break most species, and they had emerged from that experience with capabilities that couldn't be measured with standard metrics. The archivists debated classifications. Some argued for creating an entirely new category. Others suggested placing humans in the top tier of the existing system. A few recommended simply marking the human entry with a warning and letting other species draw their own conclusions. In the end, they compromised. The new index entry read: Species Homo terran. Classification: Apex persistence predator, nocturnal adapted. Threat rating: conditional extreme. Special notation: native environment includes prolonged periods of near-total darkness. Species has demonstrated unique psychological adaptation, treating low-light conditions as tactically advantageous rather than threatening. Do not engage in environments. Do not assume darkness provides concealment from human forces. Do not underestimate human capacity for patient, silent hunting. Advisory: humanity did not conquer their fear of darkness. They became what darkness fears. The index update spread across the galaxy in a matter of weeks. The effects were immediate. Trade delegations arrived at human colonies with new respect in their bearing. Species that had previously ignored humanity suddenly wanted to establish diplomatic relations. Military strategists rewrote their doctrine to account for the possibility of human involvement in future conflicts. Several expansion-minded empires quietly redirected their ambitions away from the lightless regions of space that humans had claimed. The Cygnus Reach, once considered worthless territory, was now understood to be a fortress that no one wanted to assault. They never recovered from their defeat. Their military reputation, built over 1,000 years of conquest, had been destroyed in less than 2. Other species they had conquered began to question whether they were truly as powerful as they had seemed. Rebellions broke out in their territory. Within a generation, their empire had fragmented into dozens of smaller states. Ambassador retired from the diplomatic Concord a few years after the Umbral campaigns ended. She wrote a book about her experiences, which became required reading at diplomatic academies across the galaxy. In her final chapter, she tried to explain what she had learned about humans. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy, she wrote. They are not the most technologically advanced. They do not have the largest fleet or the most territory, but they understand something that most of us do not. They understand that power is not just about what you can do. It is about what others believe you can do. And they have spent millions of years learning to be the monster in the dark that everyone else is afraid of. On Earth and in the colonies scattered across human space, life continued much as it had before. The humans did not consider themselves monsters. They were just people, living their lives, raising their families, building their civilization. But they built in the dark places. They settled worlds that other species avoided. They chose the shadows and the silence, the frozen rocks and the lightless voids. And they watched the lit places of the galaxy with eyes that had learned to see in the dark, patient as the void itself, waiting for anyone foolish enough to come looking for them. The darkness was their home. It always had been.